When you write a cookbook, there's so much that you want to tell the reader on the page, but you can't or you don't get to. So how do you write recipes that really hook cooks? Welcome to Everything Cookbooks, the podcast for writers, readers, and cooks. This is Andrea and Molly, and I'm here today with my co-host, Molly Stevens. Hey, Molly.
Hey, Andrea.
So you and I have been around for some time. We are known for going long in recipe writing to explain as much as we can on the page. In fact, we often fill pages and pages with instructions and tips.
We do that. And I think we're known for it as teachers who write. I tend to write long for my readers. And I think it must be somewhat the same for you because we have all this information in our heads that we want to convey. But I often stop and wonder, is it too much? Are there other more concise, maybe even more clever ways to communicate what I'm trying to say?
I've wondered those exact same things. And there's a new cookbook by Slagle named I Dream of Dinner So You Don't Have To. And that book really made my head kind of spin.
Me too, Andrea. It really got me rethinking how we approach making cookbooks. Allie just seems to break so many rules in making this book and in such an effective way.
So, listeners, being curious, anxious writers, Molly and I recently spoke to Allie. And our chat's going to sound a little funny to you today because I was in my kitchen with a lot of hard surfaces, and Allie was in a van in front of her house. So this is the beauty of audio. Take a listen and enjoy. Hello, Allie Slagle, rhymes with bagel. You know, you have been around recipes, cooking, and publishing for so many years. Your first book just came out. What took you so long to write such a beautiful book?
Well, if you want the honest answer, it is that I never really wanted to write a cookbook. I think I knew how much work it would be, how kind of all-encompassing it would be, and I wasn't sure I was ready for it. I had the pleasure of kind of working in many different parts of the cookbook industry. I worked on the publishing side, on the writing side, the photography side. And I just thought, I like supporting other writers. Like, I want to help them create their book. But then I met an editor by the name of Jennifer Sitt, who I know you know, who just it was like, if I was ever going to write a book, she was going to be my editor. I just thought that she was the smartest, most curious person. When she asked me if I ever wanted to write a book, I thought, well, maybe this is a sign. Maybe I have to do it.
How long ago was that?
That was maybe 2019. And I also felt like what you've talked about on this podcast. I had to feel like there was a topic that urgently needed to be published on. Like, I didn't want to write a book for the sake of writing a cookbook. Like, that wasn't really a goal of mine. I really felt like I had to find a topic that wasn't covered in the way that I might cover it.
So when you sat down with Jen, you didn't have a topic then?
Not yet, no. Once she kind of planted this seed, like, if you ever have any ideas, let me know. And then I just kind of started ruminating on it, on not just what book I would write, but what book I would write with her support. And I think she was a really big inspiration for this book.
So you talked about how you were interested in supporting other writers. And, so many books out there come from chefs and celebrities, but you root for the home cook, and that's, I think, where Molly and I just love your work so much because, we're home cooks. We're professional home cooks. What is the motivation, the impetus that you felt like you could help home cooks with?
I've never worked in a restaurant kitchen. I've never gone to cooking school. I think I've learned how to cook just by being in home kitchens and being around great home cooks. And when I worked at Food 52, I think the original message of that website was celebrating home cooks and all of their genius. And that was a really inspiring mission to me and something that I still feel really strongly about because home cooks experience difficulties and struggles in a very different way than professional cooks. And I think those triumphs are worth celebrating. I think that's why I love Andrea, so much of your work is like, there's no topic small enough that's worth sharing. You know, you've written about muslin instead of cheesecloth. Like that's such a minute thing, but truly can really change a home cook's day to day. And I think those little moments are, when they aggregate, what makes home cooking so fun.
So I have so many questions for you, Allie. One, I want to know, was it as hard as you thought it was going to be? Was it harder? Or was it easier? Because the title is brilliant. I dream of dinner so you don't have to. You know, when the idea came to you, was it a slow, like in the shower moment where like, oh my God, I have to call Jen, I've got this idea?
The first question, was it harder? I feel as though I could not have been more prepared to write this book, in the sense that like I really have worked in many different parts of book publishing, and it was still the hardest thing I've ever done. It's really all encompassing. You know, it really, if you want to do a good job, I think it kind of either takes over your life or you give your life to it. I'm not sure which one it is. My original inspiration was Nigel Slater's Eat, which I was the US editor on. And I just loved that it didn't feel like an edited text, if that makes sense. Like it felt like starting points and starting ideas that were kind of like glorious in their creativity and their simplicity. And so I was thinking about a dinner book in which the ideas can form into other ideas. And I wanted like a small size, fat book that kind of felt like a journal. Another way we thought about it was like my scribble in my notebook. Like how close can we get to my scribble in my recipe notebook that can be publishable? The title came truly like 2 weeks before the book went to print. It had a different title the entire way, and then there was a desire to change the title.
What was the title, working title?
The working title was Dinner Time,
Nice.
Which I loved. And then they felt as though they wanted something with more personality. So I had this running document of, you know, I'm sure you've had these documents too, like 400
Yes.
title ideas. And I was like, Here, find something in this document. And this is what they found.
There are 150 recipes crammed in there. Most of them are 1 page long. And it is the size of like one of Nigel Slater's books. And in writing, did you promise 150 recipes? Was there a maximum word count? How did you come to that? And I want to know, like, does that hamstring you? Because there are all of these promises up front in the book, you know, 1 or 2 pots and up to 8 ingredients. And that would like frighten me to death.
I think I like putting challenges and restrictions on myself because I think it mimics how home cooks experience cooking in a lot of ways. So I think about cooking in terms of like specific challenges, in terms of budget, time, enthusiasm, knowledge. And in every recipe, I try and work with like, well, what if you don't have a lot of time? What if you don't have a lot of money? What if you don't have a lot of knowledge? And so each of my recipes kind of try and solve for each of those situations. But in order to show kind of a comprehensive look at all of the ways you can make dinner under various limitations, I felt like I needed 150 recipes because there are so many instances when you're making dinner. And I think about it, this is like something when I worked at 10 Speed, like when they're looking at a book, they always think about the buying moment. Like, what is the moment in which you buy this book? And for me, I think about my recipes like that. Like, what is the buying moment when you're like, this is the recipe I'm going to make tonight? So whenever I'm working through recipes, I always try and think about a scenario in which this recipe would be made.
It's like at the end of the book, you give that recipe by cravings and moods, and you say, this is the recipe to make when you want to clean the veg drawer, stock the freezer, also eat lunch. And, you know, so you sort of break down, I think there are, I don't know, 10 of those or something, categories for why you would, quote, buy this recipe.
Exactly. And I think, too, like a lot of weeknight cooking or weeknight dinners is a very overpublished category. In many ways, I often struggle with like, do we need my book? Like, do we need my version? And I think the way in which this book I hoped is different is that those books are like best case scenario, like you just went to the farmer's market, you have all of Sunday, you have an hour, and those are really lovely inspiration points. But the way in which my book, I hope, is different is like, what if you really just have rice and butter? Like, what can you make? Because I have been there, and that is a real occasion in which you still deserve a good dinner, even if you didn't get to go to the market.
And so when you're writing, is your reader someone you know, or are you writing for yourself?
You're talking about the audience, right, Andrea?
Yeah. Because I'm so split on that in many regards.
So I definitely write for certain people because one which in way I think many weeknight dinner books don't speak to me is that they're speaking to like a general audience, and they're using words that have been used many times to explain a certain dish. For me, I'm thinking about like, if I make something for my friend and they text me about it and say, how do you make it? The way in which I explain how to make it is how I want it to come off in the book. So I think about certain friends of mine who I would write to who are intelligent and great cooks, but also who I have a friendly rapport with. That's the messaging I want to get through in my writing.
That totally comes through because you do this unusual thing with your head notes, the recipe introductions. And what caught me off guard, and I was actually at a dinner party last night, and I said, so I'm going to talk to this woman named Slagle, and she's got this book, I Dream of Dinner. And they're like, what? And I said, yeah, she's got these recipe introductions that just like hook me in so much. And they're like, what are you talking about? Give us an example. And I said, 1 pot rice and beans. And I explained to them what a head note is. And I said, her explanation, her hook is at the power couple. And they were like, yeah, it is the power couple in so many ways. And those kinds of head notes, we all know what a pot of rice and beans is all about. But you like come at it in a different direction. And all of a sudden you make me look at that recipe like, oh, I want to see what Allie does.
I think too, I don't know if you feel like this, but Jen, I think, gave me permission to be a little weird in the sense that I say things, when I'm talking that are maybe would be edited out of like a newspaper article or something like that. But I think in a book like this, you want to show yourself, and you want to, like, I like to use words that are like maybe not exactly the right way, like use a noun as a verb or something like that. And the copy editors don't love that, but I do think it's a illustrative way to communicate food in ways that maybe haven't been communicated before.
It's an undeniable signature of this book is your use of language. I was just reading your fried egg recipe where you say like get ready to rumble when the eggs go into the pan because they're in all this hot oil, and immediately that's very evocative. This image of like eggs splattering in hot oil, but you've set yourself up with these short and something you said earlier about your audience. They're good cooks. That comes across that you're talking to people who have a comfort level in a kitchen already. So it's not, Andrew, I talk about this a lot, how much language you offer, how much explanation. And you have an economy, not only of ingredients, but of language. And there's a lot of blank space on the page, and it makes it a very beautiful book to look at. But that's also has to have been very challenging to write. And it's just you set up some pretty high challenges for yourself by
I like to make things extremely difficult for myself.
Breaking some rules. Yeah. You couldn't pull out one of the, books on how to write a recipe and just follow, could you, Allie? You had to.
I mean, I think there are different moments for different books. Like Molly, your books I reference heartily. I am always reading them, and I appreciate that you put all of your research into it. And this book is a really different moment in time. This is like, I'm starving. I have half an hour. I don't really have time to read a head note. And in my opinion, like, you don't really need to read a head note. Like, it's just not important to the goal of eating dinner. And so with that, there is kind of a risk in having such simplistic recipes and text, which is like the assumption that maybe I rushed through it. I did do my research.
It's the absolute opposite. I'm like in awe of it. And, I read this book and I'm just like, okay, that's a brilliant combination. I'm not trying to, do deep dive research. I'm just like you said, Allie, I'm just trying to make dinner here.
Right. And I think, if someone wants to learn like all of the ways to braise, they can look at your cookbook. But if they want like a quick braise for tonight, this is the moment. And there are a lot of beginners cookbooks out there. And I think if you are a beginner cook, you can use this book. But I'm also thinking about all those people that have a good idea and understanding of cooking and just need new ideas.
Do us a favor and just like walk us through like the one pot rice and beans. How do you like put something like that together? I was like, wow, you hooked me. And then the recipe just kind of fills like half of a page. And I have this fantasy of writing really short recipes, but I don't know if I ever could. And so I feel like that particular recipe is just so amazing.
The white space on the page was an interesting point because the designer felt like there was too much white space. And I felt really insistent that white space was good because to me that like gives you room to breathe and room to like write notes and just room to not stress out. And I think in like common book design, it's like, well, where's the value? Like there's nothing on this page. And to me, it was like, that's exciting. Like there's nothing on this page. So yeah, this recipe is 3 steps and like, 2 inches by 3 inches. But the idea of rice and beans is found all over the world. And cooking rice with beans, you will see sometimes in Costa Rica and elsewhere, but I think oftentimes they're cooked separately and then eaten together. And to me, I was like, why can't you just cook them together? Like there's something about when things work together that there's like a sharing of flavor and textures that is not only efficient, but is also like delicious. So this recipe went through a lot of tests actually, because I was debating between adding the bean liquid and not adding the bean liquid. And you can do it either way, but actually having the bean liquid in the pot makes a really creamy rice dish in a way that you don't get otherwise. And also, I'm sure that there are strong opinions. You have strong opinions about this, but I went down a very long rabbit hole about rinsing rice because I never rinsed my rice, but I didn't want this book to be like, well, this is how I do it, so that's why you should do it this way. Like I wanted to actually understand what the best way was in terms of payoff for a weeknight dinner. And so I did a focus group with a lot of people about how they cook their rice. I tested all the methods and I narrowed it down, and then I tested various brands, various pots, various stove sizes. And the way in the book is the preferred way, and actually you don't rinse your rice, which I know would be controversial, but I did find that it was the most universally successful across various situations.
You just did like an America's Test Kitchen kind of approach on a very low budget. You think about it because you're thinking about, well, what's going to work for the ideal texture that you want, and that bean liquid introduces issues with viscosity, and you've got rice, starches going in there. It depends on what people want. And yes, I'm a rice rinser. So, we'll talk about that some other point.
But what I'm hearing Ali say, it's for this application, for this cooking them together in the same pot. And I just what you said about here's a recipe that takes up just, not even a page for a very universal dish. And it sounds like it took you weeks, if not months, to develop that recipe. And so that process, I mean, you said you sat down with Jen in 2019. This book came out in 2022. So how many years were you at work on recipe development to come up with 150 recipes that you not only had to develop and do focus groups and do all the work, but then had to find a way to narrow them down to their essence almost?
Molly, I had 1 year.
That's insane.
Oh my God. Did you sleep?
No, I mean, I just drove myself nuts. I mean, that's the thing. It's like I lived in this book for 1 year straight, and it was 2020. It was like isolation, pandemic. And I think in many ways that environment was very bad for my psyche, but very good for this book because I felt the need for the book in the sense that like I needed a source of joy.
I was just going to say there's so much joy in this book. And it's almost as if the recipes talk to each other, if that makes any sense, in that these tagline head note things that are, some of them are, cooking tips, some of them are instructional, some are just evocative, some are mysterious, some are snarky. There's this whole language there that you develop through them.
Where does that come from? I jotted some of them down. I just want to read them off and then maybe ask you to react. Green curry meatball soup. Meatball as a life buoy, reviving and reassuring.
It's something like that. I wanted to communicate that this is a really soothing and comforting soup without saying this is a really soothing and comforting soup. So I thought about how the soup actually looks, and there's these balls kind of floating on top, and I thought about them as rafters for our life, for the soup. You kind of have to just let your mind travel a little bit to find the thing. And in many ways, people are saying, if you wrote head notes, it probably would have been a lot easier for you, which is true. But these little taglines went through so many revisions because I wanted to get across the feeling of the soup and also maybe teach you something. It was a process.
Crispy grains with kielbasa and cabbage. Scandal. Stew ingredients. Escape pot. Flee for ripple of heat under the broiler.
So that one I had something about them being scandalous. And actually Jen was like, why don't we change this to be newspaper headline? To make it breaking news. And I was like, yes, absolutely. We should do that.
Okay, one more. Good sauce of so-so tomatoes. Roasting with olive oil, salt, and sugar brings out the tomato in even the duds.
Well, I wanted to communicate that when you have a tomato that's not great, there are things you can do to help it, like adding sugar and salt. So I wanted to get that through in the tagline, and also kind of just say, if you have bad tomatoes, we all have bad tomatoes, still eat them. Don't throw them away.
Thank you for doing that. We could go on because we've written down a lot of these, but I love that goes back to your practicality of things. If you have bad tomatoes, you're not telling people to go to the farmer's market only in August and September, and that's when you should eat tomatoes, which we hear all the time. And we all love tomatoes when they're at their height. But you're embracing the reality, and I can see how some of this came from pandemic cooking too, because you're lucky if you got to the grocery store that week or that, however often we were going. And so there's a realism to the cooking here.
Yeah, and I also should just say, I grew up in California. I totally understand the farm to table. I understand that buying produce at its height from a farmer will be a delicious thing. But I also think even if you live in the middle of nowhere and you're shopping at Walmart, that doesn't mean you shouldn't get good food every night. And so to me, that was my challenge is if you can shop anywhere, how do you still make a good dinner?
Let's go to some of the language rules that you break or you bend. We notice in those, going back to those head notes and recipe introductions, you use the plus sign, and then there are ampersands in titles and made up words, sort of Lenny's instead of lentils. Do you create your own style sheet? What do you say to the copy editor?
No, Jen was like, you have to make your own style sheet because there is, I knew from my days at book publishing and going through pages that having a style up front when you're working on a book is really helpful for preserving the intention of the book, because so many different people will be touching the text, and instead of kind of steadying many rounds of changes, it's better that everyone understands what you're going for. So I made a really specific style guide for the book that the proofreader looked at, the copy editor, the developmental editor looked at, explaining what I wanted to be the style for every book or for every recipe. And that means ampersand instead of and that, or a plus sign. And all of that really is meant to kind of just truncate the text on the page. So I thought a lot about how I wanted the information to look on the page, and its brevity is important, I think, to communicating the goal of the book.
Yeah, that's really interesting because that's one of the things Andrea and I have talked about as we've looked at your book. It just, how'd she get this through copy editing? Because you break a lot of rules. You make up your own.
I do, but I think it's really important when you're starting out on a book to be really clear about the goal and the audience for the book. And in my mind, every decision, big and small, has to work towards that goal. So for me, the goal was that moment of starving, hungry, quote unquote, empty fridge. What do I make? And so the text had to work in that moment in every way. So You don't really care if like the grammar is perfect in that moment. You don't really care if the plus sign is an and. Like you just want to get to the point as quick as possible without confusing people. So I think the question is, you know, a copy editor might find my sentence confusing, but I think it's perfectly fine. So I think it's a judgment call step by step. But as long as you feel as though it's helping your goal, and also, I know sometimes I'm wrong. Like other people's opinions are important too, but as long as we're all working towards the same goal, I should say.
Yeah, and it's very deliberate. I mean, there's a poetry to a lot of these. It's. I think of it, we talked recently with a food writing instructor, Tori Ritchie, and she talks about having her students read poetry as a way to, you know, learn about writing. And I think in some of what you're doing is you're sort of using a poetic economy in the way you're communicating. And it's interesting too is in how in some of the recipes the blank space is something that you know insist on and leave on the page, but then there are other times where you have more ways with or other ways, and it's almost like you're spilling over at that point. You just need to say, you know, some other things that you could do with these hard cooked eggs or these tahini or whatever it is. So can you talk a little bit about your decision when and how to include the extras?
Sure. In many ways, I know I've hit on a good recipe when the spillover happens, meaning when I can imagine all the different ways in which either this recipe can be eaten, so like eat it with something else, or the recipe can be modified with certain ingredients. And I think that is, for me, what makes a good recipe is when it's kind of a format that can be adapted to people's lives. So in including a lot of those end notes and tips and variations, I also just wanted to suggest that there's no one right way to make a recipe. So I think a lot of times people think that a recipe is kind of like the only way, like the end all, and you must follow it exactly. And really, that's not realistic. None of us follow recipes exactly, and we all have different kitchens and tools and etc. And so by riffing on my own recipe in the book, I wanted to provide that permission to adapt the recipe to your tastes and your situation.
Yeah, we don't all, but we want friends, right? We want friends in our kitchens. And so when you've said up front, you know, that it's like someone texts you and you text them back and you give them, you know, some guidance and some inspiration. And I feel like that is what this book is. It's like this little compilation of communications with Allie, you know, in trying to help me put dinner on the table because I just need to cross that finish line today. But I also feel there are times when I'm reading through the book and I feel as if I'm walking through an art gallery and there are these kind of like messages that flash on the wall and images of food. And it's very beautiful. It's just a very provocative book is what I want to say in so many ways. Is that something that you intended to produce?
Well, I think when I started planning the photo shoot, so we shot the whole book in my apartment in Brooklyn. And I think that was the moment where the writing too actually was part of it. But I had always worked on other people's books. So I had always kind of embodied a certain style or a certain point of view of another author. And I think I'm really good at that. And the moment when I started writing and planning the photo shoot was like, well, what is my style? Like, what I want to put forth in this book. And honestly, I feel like I've never really thought about like what my personal style is. And as I started working on the photos, I think it was like, well, it's not one style. Like it is kind of all over the place. And I thought about what my house looks like. Like I still have IKEA plates, but then I also have really beautiful handmade things. And I truly just drink out of a little seltzer can, but what's a way that I can communicate that variety and that kind of like in between life visually? And originally the idea for the images was really just to be the food on the plate on a surface. But eventually the art team was like, well, it's 400 pages. We're going to need to have some life to it. So I did sort of like let in some glassware and some linens, but the goal is that it feels like one person's house that has evolved with life and with tastes as people get older.
It's so interesting what you said, because one person's house, Andrew started off our interview by asking what took you so long to write a book. And the more we're speaking with you, the more I'm, sort of consider your book is what took you so long is that building of that house, that collection of all these influences that have made you the cook that you are. Because this book it goes all over the world in terms of influences and flavors. And it really reflects reflects someone who's had a very active engagement with cooking for a number of years and has absorbed all these influences. And I think about, like, there's the smash burger, which I'm like, oh, that's Kenji, right? It came down to me. I see an influence there. And then that zucchini with, I think it's with some chicken patties, where you fry some zucchini and throw it into a pickled shallot. And that's a very Italian fried zucchini salad. And, all these influences just percolate throughout your recipes. So, you do a beautiful thing towards the end of the book where you have a nod and you call it resources, and you just list a lot of authors whose books that have influenced you. So it really does reflect sort of the point in time, the cook that you have become.
I mean, you both have talked about this, but the reason we're in this industry is that you're always learning more. And so I do still, when I got this book deal, I still felt like, well, I'm too young. Like, what do I have to say here? But maybe that is an okay point of view for certain home cooks, because we're all just trying to figure it out and kind of meld all of these influences. But that page in the back of the book, which is, I think it's called Resources or something like that, it was really important to me to kind of communicate that these ideas don't come from nowhere. I didn't come up with all of this, that all of our cooking is a web of various influences, that we're all just kind of Rubik's cubing together so that we can figure out what works for us. And I think that's, in many ways, I feel like a conduit for all of these ideas.
And get dinner on the table.
So the photography, how many images?
Oh gosh, I think it's over 100.
Yeah, it feels like it. I want to ask how it's been, the reception of the book. Certainly, it's been getting great critical reception. How are you feeling about how people are receiving it? How's that process been?
I think the most exciting thing about the reception is that people are really cooking from the book. People have written me saying they're cooking from the book every single night. And I think that is really exciting to me because it means that the promise worked. And in many ways, this book did have risks. There is no head note. There aren't measurements in the ingredient list. I was taking some risks from a traditional cookbook format. And so the fact that it's doing its job is super exciting to me. So people are really using the book fully, which was my goal. So
are you thinking of birthing another book?
I really don't know how you guys do more than one of these.
No, we don't have children, so this is the way we birth babies. And my friends and relatives who have had children go, you kind of forget the pain.
I know. Someone who's done cookbooks and kids says, writing a cookbook is harder because when you birth the kid, it's only 9 months. A cookbook is years and years.
True.
I think, number one, it's like you have to have that idea that has to be written. And I don't want to force that process. I think you really have to find a thing that must be written. And also, I just want to make sure that what I'm saying is valuable. There's so many books out there, and I don't really want to crowd the space unnecessarily.
Allie, thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing so many great insights with our listeners. But we're going to do something a little bit different here on Everything Cookbooks. And to dive even deeper into Allie's new book, we're going to go into the kitchen and do some cooking. Hey, this is Molly, and I'm back here with cookbook author Allie Slagle. And Andrea's gone into the kitchen to cook from Allie's book, I Dream of Dinner, so you don't have to. Hey, Andrea, what's going on there?
Well, you guys, so the first recipe that I happened to have opened to when I started looking at Allie's book was a BLT stir fry. The recipe head note there said, and the T stands for tofu, and I am all about tofu. So this is bacon, lettuce, and tofu stir fry.
That sounds amazing. And it sounds like you've got something's frying.
The bacon is frying. And I wanted to ask Allie, so how did this recipe come about?
This one is kind of one of those free association exercises. I wanted to have a tofu stir fry. And so I thought about what the most delicious sauce for a tofu is, or one of the most delicious sauces. So I thought about kind of like a mapley soy sauce, black pepper sauce. And then I thought, well, what else uses maple, black pepper, or soy sauce? And I thought about bacon, like a maple black pepper coated bacon. And that kind of got me excited because in so many tofu recipes in Western publications, tofu is shown as kind of a meat substitute, but I eat meat and I love tofu, and so I don't see why you can't combine them, kind of like mapo tofu and other dishes. So I wanted to present a meat tofu dish to kind of celebrate both of those textures and flavors. So then in my mind, the tofu, bacon, soy sauce, maple was feeling very heavy, and so I wanted something light and crisp to add to it. And this book is all about really fast cooking vegetables. So I thought about lettuce. In Chinese cooking, there's stir-fried lettuce, oftentimes iceberg lettuce. But I think where my mind was going was actually killed lettuce or kilts lettuce, which is an Appalachian tradition where like the first spring greens, with the ramps and the scallions are kind of hit with the hot bacon grease and some vinegar and eaten. So the idea here is like we have the hot bacon grease, we have the vinegar and the sauce. So let's add the lettuce and make it a meal.
So we've got bacon, because when I saw this recipe, I'm thinking, okay, bacon is pork belly. Okay, and pork belly stir fry. And then we've got tofu, and I'm all about tofu and meat being exceptionally good friends. And then I see the lettuce, and I'm like, oh yeah, lettuce stir fry. So like Celtus or Celtus. But I never, until I spoke to you, until I'm asking you now, thought of like the Appalachian connection, which is like, so you just like, girlfriend, you just, built some incredible cultural bridges in this one recipe.
If I ever redid this book, in my mind, I kind of want to have like credit lines for each recipe just to kind of make the web, because I think there's always maybe one or two obvious influences, but in every recipe there could be 10 or 12, influences going into one recipe.
Yeah, I have an idea for that, but let's check with Andrea. I see you've taken the bacon out of the pan, and now you've got some tofu that you've seasoned with Allie's bacon inspired seasoning.
Well, no, the tofu I just cut into pieces like Allie told me to, and then I let it drain on a dish towel. And so the tofu sat there. They're kind of like the size of dominoes. They drain for a few hours and then coated with cornstarch and kosher salt. Diamond crystal, because I read the front of the book, because front matter matters.
The front matter is only one page, people. You can do it.
Yeah.
So that's what's going on with the tofu. And then there's the sauce that Allie mentioned with low sodium soy, rice vinegar, and maple syrup. And I put a big pinch of black pepper in there because I figured that Allie is like a peppery person.
Yep. Can I ask your opinion about this tofu size? Because on the New York Times, I have this green curry glazed tofu, which is inspired by one of your recipes, Andrea. And a lot of people are commenting that the size of the tofu is too big. And this is the same size tofu. But I really like having a 2-bite tofu.
I make that recipe all the time, and I like a 2-bite tofu.
Yeah, I think it should be 2-bite tofu. Because, if it's too small, what the problem is? It's damn hard to fry. Cutting tofu is one of the hardest things to write about, you guys, because I struggled with it big time in Evergreen Vietnamese, because I was like, sometimes tofu comes as 2 blocks now instead of 1 block. And so how do people deal with that? There are a couple of things as I was working through this recipe, Allie, that I think that are just brilliant. One of which is your use of baking sheets, which I do in my kitchen all the time. And I wish that more people use baking sheets because they are so easy to land your prepped ingredients on.
As opposed to a plate, because they're nice and flat and yeah. Agreed.
Because you're creating browning in the pan and then you're squishing it onto this resting plate when really you want all of those ingredients to kind of breathe. And a baking sheet is great for that.
And the other thing I think that's brilliant is that you are frying the tofu in bacon grease.
Right.
Yeah. There's also this other, thing that's annoying to me, which is like tofu is healthy. And it's like, well, it can be healthy, but you can also make it really fatty.
Right. And tofu is deep fried all the time. Tofu can be sexy. Tofu can be Spicy tofu has personality.
It could be crispy.
Yeah.
I love that you described the process of coming up with this recipe and that you would do a credits thing if you redid the book. But I'm envisioning this little graphic where you could just do a web and connect the dots of how we come to recipes, because it goes back to what you said, that recipes are webs, and we take these little ideas from something that we saw once or read or ate, or we file that away, and then we're working on something else sometime. You're like, ooh, what if I took that and added this to that? It's a lovely idea.
That was one of my concerns about not having headnotes, is not having the space to credit fully.
Yeah.
And so that's why I have that resources section in the back. But yeah, it was definitely something that I grappled with a lot.
Testing the recipes for this book, given that you did it on such a tight timeline, were you able to get outside testers involved?
Yeah, that was really important to me, that the recipes be tested by someone else. So all of the recipes were tested by a great tester named Laura Arnold, and she was extremely thorough in the testing and, timed every step and measured everything in 3 different ways. And I wanted that kind of rigor, because when you only are giving the most simplest instructions, you just have to make sure that they work really fully.
Yeah. Well, the ones I've made so far have all been fantastic, so I would give Laura credit. Yeah.
Thank you. And then we made them all on the photo shoot too. So I test everything, my gosh, in a best case scenario, like 3 times, in a worst case scenario, would rather not say.
Yeah.
And then they're tested by outside people.
How long was the photo shoot, Allie?
We split it up over 3 weeks, over 3 months. So I wanted kind of breaks between each shoot to kind of review and source new props and stuff like that. But we shot it during COVID in my apartment in Brooklyn, and it was 2 food stylists, so we could go kind of quickly. So they would each do a dish kind of staggered, and then I did the props, and we had wonderful, very flexible Mark Weinberg shooting it. But the goal, we really crammed in the days, but I think the point of that was so that we don't fuss over the images too much, with the goal being that the images are just showing one way in which the recipe was made. Like, this is how the recipe looked this one time it was made, and not this is the most perfect version. You should aspire to make yours look like this.
Well, and that's keeping with the unfussy nature of the recipes themselves.
So I was like, there's a lot of bacon grease in here, and I thought, oh God, what's going to happen? But there's just plenty for the next step.
And now, but you're scooping it out of the skillet and you're leaving the fat behind.
I am a sheet pan person, so it goes on my quarter sheet pan. All right, so returning that to the skillet, and then now I'm going to dump in my romaine. So Allie, this was in my neck of the woods, 1 head of romaine in Northern California, and it weighed about 1 pound. And I assume that you were probably in New York using with like parts of romaine or something like that.
Yeah, ours are a little thinner, maybe like 10 ounces, just about. My hope is that if you start putting lettuce in and it doesn't fit, that you stop putting lettuce in.
You stop putting it in.
Yeah. I do think sometimes we assume too little of our readers. I think when you start employing your brain, you will learn how to cook, right?
No, it's a good point.
So you say our onion is just wilted. So we're talking about slightly collapsed here.
Yeah, the idea is that the leafy part is wilted kind of like a spinach, but then the crisp middle part, the rib, is still crispy.
Right, so you still get that crunch, and then everything goes back in. The bacon goes back in. The tofu, the fried tofu goes back in.
So you have like this curdy tofu middle, this fried crisp of the outside on the bacon and the tofu, and then this fresh crunchy greens and soft greens, and then the sauce.
That looks fantastic.
I'm on medium heat the entire way, and I'm just going to let it kind of simmer.
Yep.
Okay. All right.
You did it.
That looks amazing.
I did it.
You can cook the recipe and do a podcast at the same time.
And look, there's a picture of it right on page 74, and I'm looking at it.
And it looks just like the picture.
All right. Well, now this isn't fair because I'm really hungry. And Allie, thank you so much for being in the kitchen with us. We just wanted to experiment with taking our podcast into the kitchen and figured if anybody would be game, it'd be you. And thanks. You did a great job, Andrea.
Well, thank you so much, Allie. And I am so looking forward to this because you dreamt up my dinner.
Good. Thanks for cooking my recipe.
Thank you so much for listening to Everything Cookbooks. If you've got a question you'd like us to answer or got a comment, please send us a note through our website, everythingcookbooks.com, or ping us on Instagram at everythingcookbooks. Thanks to our incredible editor, Abby Circatella. If you've got a minute to spare, leave a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen so that more people can find the show. And until next time, keep on writing, reading, and cooking.